The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional tick from an old wall clock. The heavy curtains blocked most of the sunlight, leaving the space in a muted amber glow. At a small wooden desk near the window, Captain Khalid al-Salim sat alone, a leather-bound notebook open in front of him. His hand hovered above the page, gripping a pen with the kind of firmness one uses in the cockpit, steady, precise, but there was a tremor he couldn't hide. He had dreamed of it again last night. The same vision, the same voice, the same eyes. Every time he woke from it, the weight in his chest grew heavier, as though the dream itself refused to leave him until he obeyed its call. Khalid inhaled deeply, then began to write. His strokes were deliberate, as though each letter carried the burden of something forbidden. "If you are reading this," he wrote, "it means I am no longer here to defend my words, and perhaps that is for the best." Somewhere behind him, faint but distinct, a rhythmic beeping echoed in the quiet, steady, mechanical, unyielding. He froze, the pen hovering above the page. He didn't need to look to know where it came from. On the far side of the room, next to a small side table, sat a portable cardiac monitor, its screen glowing in the dimness. He kept it close, not because of medical necessity, though the doctors insisted, but because that sound had been with him in the moments between life and death. The beeping dragged him backward in time without warning. He was once again lying in that cold bed under harsh fluorescent lights, tubes down his throat, the sharp smell of antiseptic filling his nose. He remembered the weight in his chest, the sterile voices speaking over him, and the strange absence of fear, the same absence he felt in the field of gold. His hand tightened around the pen. He closed his eyes, and it came to him again, the vision so vivid it felt less like a memory and more like a place he could step into at will. A vast expanse of golden grass swaying under a light that did not cast shadows. The air had been warm, yet sweet, every breath healing something invisible inside him, and in the distance, a figure walking toward him with unhurried certainty. The man in white. Khalid's eyes opened abruptly, and for a moment, the pen scraped too hard against the paper, leaving a deep indentation. He forced himself to breathe. No one would believe him, not his comrades, not his family, not the men in the grey walls of the interrogation rooms. Yet the clarity of the memory was undeniable. It was not a fever dream, nor the delirium of a dying mind. It was real as the desert sun, as real as the thrum of an engine before takeoff. He bent over the notebook again, and wrote, "If someone finds these words, they will know the truth. I was forbidden to speak." His jaw clenched as the next sentence formed in his mind, but refused to leave his hand. He knew the risk. Even hinting at such a thing could mean disgrace, exile, or worse. But if he died without telling it, then the truth would vanish with him, and so he decided it would be a message. For after his death, a confession only the future could handle. The pen moved once more, but halfway through the line he stopped. The stillness in the room pressed down on him, and for a moment he could almost hear the desert wind through the cockpit glass, feel the vibration of the controls under his palms, and see the red warning light flashing like an angry eye. Slowly, he closed the notebook. The leather cover creaked softly, the sound oddly final. Rising from the chair, he crossed the room to a small wooden cabinet. From his pocket, he drew a tiny brass key, slid it into the lock, and placed the notebook inside. The key went into a plain envelope marked only with a number, no name, no explanation. He stood there for a moment, hand lingering on the closed drawer, listening to the silence once more. One day someone would open it. One day they would read what he had seen, what he had felt. One day they would know, but not today. Khalid turned from the cabinet and walked back to the desk, his thoughts already drifting backward, beyond the letter, beyond the silence, to the life he had before that morning in the desert, the days when the world seemed certain, ordered, and free from questions that could tear a man's soul in two. In his mind, he heard his own voice, as if narrating a memory. "Before that morning in the desert, my life was..." And just like that, the past began to unspool. The image of the locked notebook lingered in Khalid's mind like the echo of a closing door. Yet behind that closed door, memories stirred, memories from a life that now felt as though it belonged to another man. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes unfocused, and the quiet of his apartment gave way to the sounds of another time, the roar of jet engines, the bark of commands, the laughter of comrades in a crowded mess hall. The past was pulling him in, and there was no resisting it. It had been a morning like so many others at the Air Academy in Riyadh. The sun climbed over the horizon, painting the runway in sharp golds and silvers, the air already tinged with the heat that would soon make the day oppressive. At 18, Khalid was lean, sharp-featured, and possessed of an intensity that both impressed and intimidated his instructors. He sat in the cockpit of a training jet, hands resting on the controls as if they were an extension of himself. "Maintain altitude, cadet, don't think, act." His instructor's voice came through the headset, clipped and precise. Khalid didn't think. He executed. Every maneuver was clean, every reaction instinctive. Months of rigorous training had taught him that hesitation was the enemy of survival. His focus was absolute, eyes locked on the horizon, aware of every vibration in the frame, every shift in the engine's hum. On the ground, far below, a man stood with his arms crossed, his father, watching. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker in his gaze, a glint of satisfaction Khalid recognized instantly. His father was a man for whom words of praise were rare, and so a glance like that meant more than any medal. As the jet descended smoothly back to the runway, Khalid felt the quiet satisfaction of being exactly where he was meant to be. Not because of faith, he had never been a particularly religious man, but because his life had been molded for this. His destiny was carved out not by divine will, but by discipline, expectation, and a family tradition that demanded service. to country. In the academy's mess hall, the air was thick with the metallic scent of tea and the chatter of young men whose bravado masked the uncertainty of their futures. Khalid sat alone, eating in silence, a habit his peers had learned not to disturb. That was, until a tray clattered against his serried captain of the skies. A voice said with mock formality. Khalid looked up to see a broad-shouldered young man with a wide grin, his dark hair curling slightly at the temples. "I'm not a captain," Khalid replied flatly. "Not yet." The man corrected himself, setting his tray down and sliding into the seat opposite. "Omar Haddad, you're the guy who never smiles, right?" Khalid raised an eyebrow. "Is that supposed to be an observation or an insult?" "Both," Omar said, and his grin widened. Against his own expectations, Khalid found himself smirking just barely. That was the beginning. From that day forward, Omar was a constant presence, in training exercises, in study halls, in the cramped confines of flight simulators. They were different in temperament or more quick to joke, Khalid measured and reserved, but in the air, they moved as one. A subtle glance, a single word, was enough to communicate entire strategies. A year later, on a rare weekend leave, Khalid returned to the family home in Riyadh. The streets of his neighborhood were alive with the familiar scents of spices and freshly baked bread. His mother greeted him at the door, wrapping him in a hug that made him feel, for a fleeting moment, like the boy who used to run through these streets barefoot. "You look thinner," she said, holding him at arm's length to study his face. "It's the training, mother." "I'm fine," he answered. Her expression softened, but her eyes sharp and knowing remained searching. As she poured tea, she looked directly at him. "Khalid, promise me you will always come home." He hesitated. The weight of her words hung in the air between them. He lowered his gaze to the steam curling from his cup. "I will do everything I can," he said finally. It wasn't the promise she wanted, and they both knew it. That night, lying awake in his childhood room, Khalid listened to the distant hum of the city and thought about the two worlds he inhabited, the rigid, calculated order of military life, and the warm, unpredictable rhythm of home. The years that followed were a blur of dawns breaking over the airfield, the sky bleeding from deep indigo to blistering blue. The desert was both a training ground and a silent adversary, its heat unyielding, its winds capable of turning a routine flight into a battle of endurance. Khalid and Omar developed a ritual before every mission, walking the length of their aircraft, inspecting every bolt, every panel. "Never trust the mechanic's report," Khalid would say. "Trust your eyes." Omar would grin and reply, "And trust me when I say this heat is killing me." These were the rhythms of their lives, the hum of engines warming on the tarmac, the crackle of the radio, the scent of fuel in the air. There was no time for philosophical questions or spiritual pondering. The world was reduced to checklists, protocols, and the camaraderie of those who understood the risks without needing to voice them. Then came the morning that would change everything. The sky was clear, the air drier, perfect day for a reconnaissance mission. Khalid and Omar were on the roster, their names printed on the assignment board in neat black letters. They went through the motions as they always did, briefing, equipment checks, a quick exchange of jibes to break the monotony. Climbing into the cockpit, Khalid felt the familiar surge of anticipation. His hands moved over the controls with practiced ease, the canopy lowering with a hydraulic hiss. Through the glass he caught Omar's thumbs up from the rear seat. "Routine flight," Omar said, "over the comms. In and out before the sun turns this place into an oven." Khalid allowed himself the faintest smile. "Stay focused." As the engines roared to life, the vibrations coursed through the frame and into Khalid's bones. The runway stretched out before them, shimmering in the heat. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like every other mission. Safe, predictable, that he didn't know it then. But in a matter of hours, that illusion would shatter. The air was clear that morning, the kind of crystalline blue that made the desert look endless and unthreatening. From the cockpit, Khalid could see the horizon stretching in all directions, the dunes below curling into golden waves. It was the perfect day for a mission. No sandstorms, no turbulence, no sign of trouble. The engines hummed with a steady, reassuring vibration. His gloved hands moved over the controls with mechanical precision, checking and rechecking each gauge. Behind him, Omar's voice came over the comms, light and casual. "Routine recon," Omar said. "We'll be back before the coffee in the mess hall goes stale." Khalid allowed himself the faintest smile, though his eyes never left the instruments. "Eyes on the mission," he replied, the habitual reminder both men had heard 100 times before. The jet climbed steadily, the desert floor falling away until the shapes of trucks and outposts became nothing more than dots on a vast canvas of sand. The sun climbed higher, catching the canopy glass and bathing the cockpit in an amber glow. Khalid felt the familiar calm of being airborne, the silence of thought, the rhythm of procedure. Then, without warning, a red light flared on the panel. The first alert was subtle, a low, insistent beep, accompanied by a single warning indicator. Khalid's hands tightened around the throttle. He scanned the readouts. St. John 1 was losing power. It was an unusual fault, but not catastrophic. "Omar, I'm reading partial power loss on the left engine," he said evenly. "I see it," Omar replied, his tone still calm but sharper now. "Want me to run a secondary diagnostic?" "Do it." They moved through the emergency checklist with practiced precision. It was the kind of drill they had rehearsed countless times. Yet as they worked, the beeping multiplied, first 2 alarms, then 3, each with its own tone, until the cockpit was filled with a discordant chorus of urgency. The red light was joined by amber, then more red. A sudden shudder rippled through the frame of the jet. Khalid's stomach clenched. He could feel the airframe resisting him, the controls stiffening. His eyes flicked to the external temperature gauge. It was spiking. The smell of something burning seeped into the cockpit, acrid and metallic. Smoke began to curl from the panel, seems thin at first, then thick enough to sting his eyes. "Fire in the left engine," Khalid said, his voice clipped. "Controlled, I'm cutting fuel flow." Omar responded immediately. The heat in the cockpit intensified, oppressive, and suffocating. Khalid felt sweat sliding down his temples under the helmet. He could hear the roar of the failing engine fighting against the air, the vibrations becoming more violent with each passing second. Then came the sound he dreaded most, a deep, resonant bang, followed by a lurch so sudden it felt as though the entire aircraft had been kicked by an invisible giant. The nose dipped sharply, and the altimeter began to unwind. They were losing altitude fast. Controls not responding, Khalid shouted over the noise. His hands pulled back on the yoke, but it felt like trying to lift a slab of concrete. Through the static, Omar's voice came again, strained now. We've got smoke in the rear compartment. I'm losing visibility back here. The desert rushed up at them through the canopy, dunes now distinguishable in sharp detail. The alarms screamed. Khalid's mind worked faster than the chaos around him. Altitude, speed, distance to the nearest viable landing zone. The numbers didn't add up. Omar braced. He barked. He tried one last maneuver, angling the nose slightly to avoid a jagged ridge of rock. The controls groaned under the strain. For a moment it felt like the jet might level out, then the right engine coughed, sputtered, and died completely. The cockpit filled with the high-pitched wail of total power loss. In the split second before impact, Khalid's eyes were drawn away from the instruments. He saw, unbidden, the face of his mother, her eyes fixed on his. The same expression she had worn the night she asked him to promise he would come home. Then everything went white. There was no sensation of crashing, not at first, only a violent, bone-deep jolt that seemed to tear the world apart. Metal screamed and twisted, the air filled with the deafening roar of destruction. The harness dug into his shoulders. His helmet slammed against the seat frame. The impact threw him forward, then sideways. Then everything was a chaotic blur of light, sound, and pain. The noise faded abruptly, replaced by a ringing in his ears. He was dimly aware of his body, of heat, of pressure, of something wet pooling under him, but the signals from his limbs felt distant, unimportant. His vision narrowed, the edges darkening. Somewhere, faintly, he thought he heard Omar calling his name, but it was like a voice underwater, unreachable. A cold weight settled over him, and his last conscious thought before the darkness took him was the image of his mother, smiling this time, standing in the doorway of their home. And then there was nothing. Silence came first, but it was not the silence of an empty room or a paused conversation. It was thicker than that, viscous, dimensional, a darkness that felt like it had weight. Khalid did not know whether he was falling or floating. He only knew that his body had ceased to matter. There was no pressure on his chest, no ache in his limbs, no blistering heat in the cockpit. The ringing in his ears from the impact began to thin, unraveling into a low, resonant hum, like the pulse of the earth magnified 1,000 times and played through the bones of a mountain. He tried to move and discovered that intention arrived before any notion of muscles. The idea of lifting a hand came to him and then drifted away, as meaningless as the suggestion to fly in a place without air. There was no air, there was no breath, and yet he felt sustained, as if some other mechanism simpler was keeping him intact. Then the dark changed. It rippled, somewhere beyond sight. A current passed through the black, and he felt it on what might have been his skin, a faint chill. Then a sweep of something cooler, like night wind through a doorway. The hum deepened, became layered with tones, as if a choir of seas was speaking to itself in an unhurried language. He realized, suddenly and without panic, that he was not alone. The thought did not frighten him. It did not comfort him either. It simply arranged itself inside the quiet, the way a star arranges itself inside a sky. He could not say whether a moment had passed, or an hour when the floor under him, for there must have been a floor, softened and vanished. The sensation of weight returned, not as an ache but as an axis, and he understood that he was standing. There were no coordinates to pin the standing to, no horizon to measure, and then there was light, gentle and unaggressive, touched the black and lifted. It did not burst or glare. It rose like dawn, arriving in several directions at once. With it came color, muted first, the pale suggestion of gold and green, till the view around him assembled itself into a place. He stood in an endless field, where the grass shone with a soft honeyed hue, each blade bending to a breeze he could not feel but somehow heard. The sky above held light without a sun. It suffused rather than shone, a radiance that refused to throw shadows. The horizon did not end so much as it relaxed into distance, as if the world had stretched itself and found there was more room in it than it had ever known. I am dreaming, he thought, and the field agreed with him by not changing at all. Sound returned, but not the sound he knew. It was more vibration than noise, a low tremor like waves turning on themselves far offshore, or a large bell rung underwater. He noticed that the hum responded to his attention when he tried to listen harder. It became gentler, meeting him in the middle so he would not strain. It seemed absurdly considerate. He became aware then of a subtle pressure in his chest, not pain, but fullness, like drawing breath after being submerged for too long. The next thought arrived with the clarity of something spoken aloud. You are alive. It startled him, because the sentence did not come in words. It arrived as a reality placed in his hands. He almost laughed, except laughter felt too narrow for this light, too mechanical for a place that appeared to be made of response rather than resistance. He looked down, half expecting to see the flight suit, the scuffed knees, the stain of smoke. What he saw defied the expectation of fabric or skin. He was there and whole, defined by edges when he needed edges and undefined when the edges were unnecessary. If he wanted a hand, there was a hand. If he wanted to turn his head, the world turned with him. None of this troubled him. He had the distinct sense that explanations would be permitted later, if he insisted. For now, there was only the field, and the light, and that ocean-sounding hum that seemed to say everything at once without saying anything at all. He began to walk. The grass parted like friendly water, parting not from pressure but from courtesy. The distance did not diminish the way it does on earth. It opened. Each step brought more step to take, not as a punishment but as an invitation. After a time, here being a ribbon that tied itself differently than he remembered, he realized that he was not walking towards something so much as being welcomed through a series of nearnesses he had not noticed until he was inside them. Then a precise touched his awareness, the way a bird might touch a sky and make a point of it. Someone was near. He stopped, but stopping did not matter because the newness was no longer directional. It arrived without approach, like the moment a fragrance enters a room it had always been in. He turned, and the world arranged a figure. At the horizon a speck that was not a speck in white, that was not quite white, because the light here refused to be forced into a single name. The figure did not move, and yet with each blink, it was closer. Khalid was not alarmed. Every part of this place asked him never to be afraid again, and the asking was gentle enough to feel like permission. He thought of his mother, then without effort, without ache. He remembered the tea steam curling between them, the seriousness in her gaze, the question she had asked him, and the promise he had not made. He saw her hands, small, competent, setting a cup on the table, and the memory slid into the light, as if it had always belonged there. He tried to hold the image, but it did not need holding. It trusted him enough to remain available. The figure was closer now. The hem of a garment moved in a wind that did not bend the grass, and the sense of being known, a sensation he had never considered a sensation, grew around him like a temperature. Khalid felt, with peculiar certainty, that if he wished to run he could not because he was trapped, but because running would be an untrue verb here. Only making room was possible. So he did. He stood and made room. He recognized then the nature of the silence. On earth, silence is the absence of sound. Here, silence was the presence of attention, complete, radiant, uninterruptible attention, like finding yourself seated in the center of a gaze that is not eyes, a listening that is not ears. It gathered everything he was and returned it more clearly than he had ever seen it. The figure took a final smallness of distance and was before him. Khalid did not think to bow or speak. Words were tools designed for inadequate rooms. This room needed no tools. The robe was simple, a long fall, of fabric that glimmered along its weave as if woven from light that had learned to behave like cloth. Over it lay something like a mantle, gold where gold forgot to be metal and remembered how to be warmth. The face was that of a man neither young nor old, neither foreign nor familiar, rested in an ease that did not have to be chosen. Eyes, when they lifted, were not merely eyes. They were deep places that did not end in seeing but continued into remembering, as if they had once looked at everything that could be looked at and had decided to love it. When he spoke, he did not use sound. The meaning arrived in Khalid's heart first, and the heart translated it for the mind. I know you. The sentence found an exact seat inside him. He wanted, suddenly, to laugh again, or perhaps to cry, because it had been so long, maybe forever, since anyone had known him without his explanations. He thought of the medals he had polished, and the flight hours he had logged, and the careful, correct man he had spent years learning to be. And all of those constructs drifted politely to the edge of the field to wait their turn, because they were not the point. The figure took a single step. There were marks in his hands, clean and old, real and not raw, the way history is real when it is finally understood. Khalid stared at them without horror, without the impulse to look away, because the marks did not accuse. If anything, they forbore. He knew, without knowing how he knew, that the wounds were not a memorial to suffering but a grammar in which love had once written itself, and continued to write. Who are you? He tried to ask, and the question arrived in the space between them, not as suspicion but as hunger. He heard his name in answer, not the sound of it, but the meaning of it, the name his mother had spoken over him when he was too young to remember, the one his father had carved in his gaze when his approval was a star in a strict night. It came accompanied by a tenderness that made him understand why he had not been permitted to carry fear into this place. The tenderness was not softness. It was authority perfected into kindness. When he looked up, the figure's eyes held oceans. There was no other way to phrase it. They did not hold water. They held the truth of water, the patience of it, the persistence and the faithfulness and the shape-giving it performs on rock when given enough years. In those eyes he saw the arc of his own life. A boy running through hot streets, a cadet, breathless under a drill sergeant's shout, a pilot measuring distance and drag in crosswinds, a son telling his mother he would do everything he could. He saw the day he had learned to keep his face still when confronted with loss, and the night he had decided there was safety in rituals that never ask what they mean. He did not see condemnation. He saw invitation. The hum around them shifted. It became music only because he needed it to be, the way water is only a river because a bank insists. The light deepened, the green and the gold of the field, and the air sweetened until each not breath he took cured a grief he had not known. He realized he had been living with a background noise, a droning worry under every triumph, a buzz of contingency behind every yes, and that here, without requesting permission, someone had turned that noise off. He remembered the cockpit then, not as terror but as completion. He remembered the blare of the alarms and the stinging smoke and Omar's voice strangled by static. He remembered the moment the right engine died and the world tried to climb into his chest. He remembered the final unspooling of altitude and, at the very end, the face of his mother, looking at him the way light looks at a window. The memory rose intact, weighed itself, and rested without thorns. Will I go back? He thought, and the thought tasted like a broken rule. The figure did not answer immediately, and the delay was not absence. It was reverence for the question, for the asker, for what both would require if the answer were yes. Khalid felt then, as clearly as if it had been whispered against his ear, that nothing here would ever be forced upon him. Consent mattered. Choice mattered. He could stay. He understood this as surely as he understood how to flare on landing. He could stay. In the field would teach him new words for joy until joy itself was no longer new. But even as the possibility lifted before him like a door opening onto sunlight, another possibility approached, one threaded with grit and hospital light and the weight of a body that would hurt him again. Along that possibility, faces moved. Omar's first half, bent by worry. Samira's, though he did not know her name yet. The physician's steady gaze in which the word impossible quailed and learned humility. And then strangers, many strangers whose names he did not know and would never know, yet whose lives might find a gentler angle if he returned to I am a soldier, he thought, and the figure's eyes warmed as if to say that this was true. And also he was more. A windless change moved through the place, and a memory opened the way a hand opens. His father, arms crossed at the edge of a runway, not smiling but shining. His mother's cup set on the table, the steam writing lines that meant home. Omar clapping him on the shoulder after a clean landing. The academy's dawns, stacked one beside the other until they were a wall and a path both. The truth that arrived with those images was not sentimental, it was architectural. It said, you were built to bear things. The figure raised a hand not to bless yet, not to command, and Khalid saw again the marks. They startled him less now. They were not only marks, they were doors, and behind them a world had once turned itself inside out so this field could exist and, more strangely, so that a place with gravity and pain and diesel smell could also be loved. He tried to speak gratitude and discovered, for the first time since arriving, a word might be right. Thank you, he said, and the field, the light, the sound, and even the marks answered, you're welcome, in 1,000 small codices, the softening of the horizon, the rippling of gold in the knot wind, the way attention held him without asking anything he could not give. When the answer came at last to the question he had not dared to press, it came embedded in another offering, not a sentence, not a commander knowing, you will be sent. The grammar of it confessed a sender and affirmed a purpose. He did not argue. A pressure gathered at the edges of the world then, the way pressure gathers before rain. The light intensified, brighter but nearer, and the hum folded into a single tone that resonated through him like a bell struck in his bones. Khalid understood that the field was not ending, it was making way. He also understood that he could refuse. The refusal would be honored without injury or insult. To stay would not be selfishness, to go would not be bravery. Both would be obedience, if chosen truly. He thought of Omar again, closer now than a memory. He thought of a room he had not seen yet, white and cold with fluorescent light. And of a woman whose eyes would call a 7-minute absence by its right name, miracle or mystery, depending on which language courage prefers. He thought of his mother, not because he would have to leave her, but because he would have to carry her trust more carefully than he had before. I will go, he allowed himself to know. The figure did not smile with his mouth, and yet the place smiled. Something like a blessing moved over him, not oil, not water, not words, but all three as sacrament. He felt his name spoken again, and with it the reassurance that nothing here could be lost on the way back. Even the field would travel with him, if he agreed to make room for it among the machines and the rules. The pressure increased, and the gentleness of it broke him open. He had one last impulse, shaped by earth and habit, to hold on. He looked into those ocean eyes and found there a request that turned holding into giving. He let go. The field tilted. The hum split into many alarms. Light retracted into thin, straight forms, strips above a bed. Gravity returned like a weight dropped from some merciful height. Pain sharp, bright, present arrived not as punishment, but as proof. The taste of plastic found his mouth. The ache in his chest learned again the unreliable rhythm of breathing. The kindness of the place did not leave. It tucked itself behind the pain, gloved his ribs, steadied the unsteady. He heard dim and immediate voices, commands practiced so often they could be shouted without panic. Numbers, the word clear. For an instant, as the world resolved into tubes and beeping and hands on his body, he nearly turned to see. If the field would consent to a farewell glance, he did not need it. Farewells are 4 doors that close. This door would remain open, not as a temptation to flee but as an oath to keep. His eyes struggled, fought the weight, and rose. The light was clinical and cold. Beyond it, faces converged, and among them a pair of calm honey-colored eyes, steady and human and full of relief. A voice spoke near his ear, and this time sound mattered again. Stay with us, it said. You're back. Khalid kept falling into his body and rising into the memory at the same time. Somewhere beneath the ache, the field still breathed. Somewhere within the beep, the ocean still rolled. He could not form a word around the tube in his throat, but a tear made its own language down his cheek. It tasted, unbelievably, of sweetness. The room swarmed with motion and instruction, but nothing hurried inside him. He lay between two realities and found, to his amazement, that they were not enemies. He had been sent. The sending was complete. What waited now would be a life fissured by lighter, life that would never again belong entirely to the world that believed in engines and outcomes. He understood that secrecy would be his companion, that courage would sometimes mean silence, and that love, when it arrived with its old insistence, would ask him to cut away parts of the man who had once loved discipline more than truth. A hand squeezed his shoulder. He could not turn to see whose it was, but he did not need to. The field had taught him the shape of presence. He closed his eyes and let the machines declare their victory in stubborn, grateful beeps. Somewhere at the left edge of the room, a monitor wrote his heartbeat in green. Small hills marching forward across a black plain, relentless in their promise. He was back. The pain could have the body. He had brought something with him the pain could not touch. He would sleep now, or descend into a fog that was more function than rest. And later, when language returned and questions assembled themselves like a tribunal on the far side of the bed, he would answer none of them with what had truly happened. Not yet, not until a letter was written and a key placed in an envelope, without a name, but that was later. Now there was only a breath pressed into him by a machine and another breath coming, and in between them, a voice still speaking his name from a field without shadows, promising him that the sending would teach him how to live among borders as if they were already undone. The voice dimmed without disappearing. The light receded without leaving. He surrendered to the heaviness of survival and felt, as he sank, the gentlest pull at the back of his being, as if heaven were holding the end of a thread tied around him, willing to be tugged, prepared to answer, patient as a sea dot, and in that faithful patience, between one monitored beat and the next, his world began again. The figure was still distant, yet nearer than it had any right to be. Khalid could not tell whether it was he who moved toward it or it who closed the distance. Each blink rewrote the horizon, drawing the white-robed presence closer until the space between them seemed both infinite and gone. The robe caught the light in a way nothing else in this place did, absorbing it, reshaping it, sending it back, softened beneath the hem, the grass bent without breaking, as though greeting an old friend. The mantle draped over the shoulders shimmered faintly, a suggestion of gold more felt than seen. The way warmth is felt before a fire comes into view. Heart if it was still, his heart was no longer pounding as it had in the cockpit. Here it moved differently, slower, deeper, like a drum in a cavern. He did not feel fear. This place allowed no fear to enter, yet what he felt was far beyond calm. It was the unsettling awareness of being completely seen. The figure stopped, few paces away. No wind stirred, yet the fabric of the robe shifted gently, as though to acknowledge him. Then the eyes lifted. They were unlike any eyes Khalid had ever met. Deep, yes, but more than depth. They contained weight, as if each glance held the gravity of oceans. The irises were not fixed in one color. They shifted between shades, from warm honey to a green touched by light, then to a blue so deep it felt like memory. Looking into them, Khalid had the disorienting impression of seeing every moment of his life at once, not as a film played back, but as a truth already complete. When the voice came, it did not break the silence. It was the silence, given shape. I know you. The words were not heard in his ears. They arrived directly inside him, bypassing the machinery of sound. They carried no question, no doubt, no request for confirmation. They simply were. Khalid felt his breath if breathing was still real. He catch in the military. He had lived a life of defined ranks and layers, where identity was worn like a badge and reduced to a role. Here, that outer shell dissolved. Whoever this being was, he knew the man underneath, the boy running through the hot streets of Riyadh, the cadet pushing through drills, the son who had avoided making promises he might break. The figure stepped forward, the space between them folded in a way Khalid could not name, and now they were only an arm's length apart. The robe shifted, and the hands emerged. Khalid's gaze fell to them and froze. There were marks in the center of each palm. Not wounds exactly, for wounds are raw. These were whole, yet carried the undeniable story of having once been torn. The edges were smooth, healed by something not of this world, and the depth of them was not of injury, but of meaning. He could not look away. The figure opened his hands fully, letting Khalid see. The act was not theatrical. It was simply generous. And with the opening came understanding, not through reason, but through a sudden alignment of everything Khalid had ever been taught and everything he had never been told. He knew who stood before him. The name rose in him without effort, a knowing older than his own life. His chest tightened, not with pain, but with the unbearable fullness of recognition. Jesus. Khalid's knees weakened. He had been raised in a culture where this name was absent from reverence, or at best confined to the pages of another people's belief. And yet here, stripped of every border and badge, the truth of that name pressed against him with a weight that was neither coercion nor persuasion. It simply was. The eyes held him, and in them he saw no accusation, no list of his failures, only a patient invitation, as if the one before him had been expecting this meeting for far longer than Khalid had been alive. Jesus spoke again, in Khalid's own language, the words, wrapping around him like water over stone. I have known you since before you were born. It was not flattery. It was not even comfort. It was a fact. The kind of fact that rearranged the architecture of everything else you thought was true. Khalid wanted to speak, wanted to say he did not deserve to be here, that he had done nothing to earn this light, that he had spent his life saluting flags and protocols, not searching for God. But even as these thoughts formed, they crumbled. Jesus already knew. For a moment Khalid felt the urge to ask why. Why him? Why now? But the question died before reaching his lips. In the presence of such knowledge, why was irrelevant. Instead, something else filled the silence, a sense that this meeting was not an end, but a summons. That he was here to receive something, and perhaps to be given something in return. He thought of the jet, broken and burning on the desert floor. Of Omar, somewhere beyond the smoke, shouting into the static, of his mother's face, appearing in that final moment before the world went white. A gentle certainty settled over him. He could stay. This place was not eager to send him away, and yet he also sensed another path, one that led back through the weight and pain of a body, back into the noise and danger of the world he had left. The choice was his. Khalid looked into those eyes again. The depth in them was endless, but not cold. In their expanse, he saw a kind of power that did not need to demand, it simply made space for truth. The air between them seemed to pulse, not with sound, but with the possibility of a decision. Though no words passed his lips, Khalid felt his soul forming the question, what do you want me to do? The answer did not come in words. It came as a vision, faces he did not know, lives he had not yet touched, a child's laugh somewhere in a village, the clasp of a stranger's hand in a moment of need, the stillness of a man who found hope at the very edge of despair. Will be sent. The phrase was not a command, but a truth already decided beyond his comprehension. It was not forced on him, it was offered, as one might offer a door left open. Khalid's throat tightened. He knew what this meant. Going back would mean pain. It would mean secrecy. It would mean walking through a world that could not understand. This moment might punish him for it, but staying meant never touching those faces, never carrying this light back to the dark. He lowered his gaze, then lifted it again. Steady. I will go. The eyes softened not with relief, but with the kind of joy that honors courage. Jesus reached out, placing one marked hand lightly over Khalid's chest. The touch was warm, but not hit. It was a recognition, a sealing of the choice. In that instant, the field seemed to draw a breath. The light brightened, and the horizon began to shift. Khalid felt something gathering around him, not to harm, but to return. He had the sudden, vivid understanding that the next moment would hurt. Not here, not in this place, but there in the body waiting for him, broken and gasping. He looked once more into the eyes that had known him before the world began, and then, the pull came. The pull began softly, like the tide shifting beneath a swimmer's feet. Then it grew. The field, the light, the air itself, all of it began to stretch away from him, not vanishing, but receding like a shoreline he had just left. The warmth of the hand over his chest remained for a moment longer, steadying him, grounding him in the choice he had made. Then that warmth, too, began to withdraw, not in abandonment, but as if stepping aside for what had to come next. The golden grass blurred as though the colors were being drawn into a single thread. The sound that had held his soul, steady thinned until it was just one pure tone. Khalid understood that this was the point of no return. Pain waited for him on the other side. The air shifted. A sudden weight began to press against him, not crushing, but real earth, real body, real. He felt the faintest tug in his chest, a rhythm struggling to reassert itself. And then, without warning, the descent. The light snapped into narrow beams. The tone broke apart into jagged bursts of sound, alarms, hurried voices, the mechanical hiss of machines. Cold replaced warmth, stabbing into his skin. His chest convulsed. His eyes flew open. White light seared them instantly, harsh and sterile. Nothing like the golden radiance of the field. The ceiling above him was unfamiliar, flat, lifeless, broken only by rectangular panels and the glare of fluorescent tubes. He tried to breathe, but something blocked his throat. The taste of plastic filled his mouth, dry and bitter. The tube sat like an intruder, forcing air into his lungs with a rhythm that wasn't his own. His body was leaden, every muscle heavy, bound by straps and the stubborn gravity of weakness. The noise around him sharpened. Pulses back 7 minutes flat. BP's stabilizing. Hold that line. Watch his airway, don't pull the tube yet. Faces leaned over him, framed by masks, their eyes moving quickly, their hands a blur of motion. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that beat and blinked, their colors cold against the sterile white. A wave of pain surged through him, starting deep in his chest and radiating outward. It was sharp, raw, and alive. In its wake came the reality of his injuries, every fracture, every tear, every insult to his body announcing itself in merciless detail. He wanted to speak, to ask about Omar, to ask where he was, to say, "I'm here," but the tube stole every word before it could form. Then, through the blur of movement, a pair of steady eyes locked on his. Honey-colored.com. The woman they belonged to wasn't rushing. Her movements were deliberate, precise. Even behind the mask, he could feel the composure in her presence. She leaned slightly closer, speaking in a voice that somehow reached through the noise. "You're back. Stay with us." Something in the way she said it told him she knew exactly what back meant, even if she didn't know where he had been. A tear escaped the corner of his eye, warm against the cold air of the room. It slid down toward his temple and stopped, there trapped by the angle of his head. No one wiped it away. He didn't want them to. The beeping of the monitor slowed fractionally, settling into a steadier rhythm. He could feel the machine helping him breathe, each rise and fall of his chest slightly less alien. The pain didn't leave, but it receded, enough for him to notice something else, something impossibly quiet beneath the chaos. The hum was still there, faint, far away, but it hadn't gone. The memory of the field shimmered behind his eyelids, a truth he could carry now without fear of it dissolving. He couldn't tell them, not yet, not the doctors, not his superiors. This was a secret that needed the right moment, the right witness, the right purpose. The hands worked over him, adjusting tubes, checking vitals. The cold smell of antiseptic clung to the air, mixing with the faint scent of burned fabric that still lingered on him. Somewhere in the background, a voice said his name, not the way Jesus had said it, but enough to anchor him here. Khalid closed his eyes again, not to sleep, but to hold on to the thread still connecting him to that other place. He was back in the world of borders, ranks, and unspoken rules, but part of him would never come all the way back. The machines kept their vigil, their rhythm a promise. For now you are alive, and beneath it all, quiet but unbroken, the hum waited patient as the sea. The day Khalid left the hospital was bright, but the light felt different now, not harsher, just more insistent, as though the sun itself was demanding he notice it. The air was heavy with the scent of hot pavement and distant cooking oil from a street vendor's cart. A military vehicle waited at the curb, its dark paint gleaming. Under the midday heat, 2 soldiers stood by its open door, faces blank, postures rigid. He moved slowly, each step deliberate. His body had healed enough to walk without assistance, but the stiffness in his muscles betrayed weeks of lying still. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of diesel from the street, a smell he had always ignored before. Now it came to him, layered, textured, mixed with the faint perfume of blooming jasmine from somewhere unseen. Inside the vehicle, the ride was silent. No one asked him about the crash. No one mentioned Omar. He stared out the window, watching the city roll past vendors calling out prices in the marketplace, boys chasing a battered soccer ball down an alley, a mother steadying a child's head as they crossed the street. These were scenes he'd passed 1,000 times before, yet today they pressed against him like they were asking him to remember them. Back at the base, the familiar smell of metal and oil greeted him in the hangar. A few men nodded in acknowledgement, but their glances lingered, measuring him in ways they hadn't before. His quarters were exactly as he'd left them, bed made tight, boots aligned, desk bare except for a single pen. But he felt as though he was walking into someone else's room. A life paused mid-breath. He resumed his duties in the days that followed, but not in the same way. He found himself holding back in conversations, letting others speak, resisting the urge to cut in with orders or corrections. In the mess hall, he listened more than he talked, noticing the way young recruits laughed too loudly to hide their nerves, the way older officers clung to routines like talismans. Small details claimed his attention now. The exact way a soldier's hand trembled when pouring tea. The quick glance exchanged between two mechanics over a broken part. The pattern of dust gathering along the hangar's north wall, shaped by the wind that always came in from the desert. These things had always been there, but he had never thought to notice them before. When the first opportunity for kindness came, it was almost by accident. A new recruit had been assigned to maintenance, struggling to fit a stubborn component into a jet's engine bay. Khalid passed by, paused, and without a word, took the tool from his hands. He showed him how to angle it just right so it slid into place. The recruit's eyes lit with relief, and Khalid stepped back without explanation, disappearing before thanks could be offered. Other acts followed. A soldier's wife and children had lost their home to a kitchen fire. Khalid left an unmarked envelope with enough cash to keep them afloat for a month, sliding it under their door in the dead of night. No note, no signature. Another evening, he visited the quiet side of the base cemetery, where fresh flowers never lasted more than a day. He replaced them himself, careful to choose ones that would last longer. He didn't seek recognition. In truth, he avoided it. The acts were not about being seen, they were about answering something that had begun inside him in that golden field. And yet, the more he acted this way, the more he felt the distance growing between himself and the others. In tactical meetings, the old instincts to plan strikes, to anticipate weaknesses, to calculate outcomes were still there, but they now came with a shadow. He could picture the people on the other end of those decisions, faces that looked like the ones in the market, in the alleys, in the village squares. He began declining assignments without obvious reason, volunteering instead for logistical roles that kept him away from the front lines. Some colleagues shrugged it off as caution after injury. Others weren't so forgiving. It didn't take long for the questions to start. They came first from Pierce's casual remarks that pretended to be jokes. "Careful, Khalid. You're starting to sound like a peacekeeper." Or, "You've gone soft since the crash." Then came the subtle probes from higher up. In an office heavy with cigarette smoke, a senior officer leaned back in his chair and studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You don't seem the same as before," he said. "The man who boarded that jet was sharp, decisive. You hesitate now." Khalid kept his eyes steady. Caution is part of discipline. The officer's gaze narrowed. Caution is good. Hesitation gets people killed. It wasn't a threat, not directly, but Khalid heard the warning behind it. Nights became his refuge, while the rest of the base quieted into the hum of generators and the occasional bark of a guard dog. Khalid sat at his desk with a single pen he'd left untouched since before the crash. He stared at the blank paper for nights on end, the weight of what he wanted to write pressing against him. It wasn't a report. It wasn't a confession. It was a testimony. Not for the military, not for the government, for someone else entirely. Someone he didn't know yet, but felt certain would one day need to read it. When he began, the words came haltingly. "There is something I have seen that I cannot keep to myself." He paused, then added, "If this reaches you, it will be because the time was right." He wrote about the light, about the field, about the robe in the hands and the voice that wasn't a voice. He wrote without trying to explain it, because he knew explanation was impossible. He only described it as he had experienced it, trusting that the truth was in the telling, not in the proof. The more he wrote, the more the page seemed to absorb the burden of carrying this secret. And as the words filled the paper, he felt a strange calm settle over him. Not the calm of the field that was beyond anything here, but a smaller, quieter calm that belonged to this side of life. By the time the call to morning prayer drifted faintly from the city beyond the base, the first page was full. He read it once, then folded it and placed it in the envelope. For now, it would remain hidden, but its time would come. And when it did, he knew it would carry more than his words. It would carry the moment when a soldier who had lived by the rule of orders learned what it meant to be sent for a different purpose. The night was still. The kind of stillness that made even the smallest sounds, footsteps on gravel, the rustle of a curtain, seem amplified. The base had long gone to sleep. From his desk, Khalid could hear the low hum of the generator in the far corner of the compound, steady and mechanical, a heartbeat for the whole installation. The letter lay before him, folded and unfolded so many times that its creases had grown soft, the paper bending without resistance. He had read the first pages over and over, not to edit them, but to make sure they still carried the weight he had intended. They did. But something was missing, something that had been pressing against his chest for weeks, waiting for the right moment to be written. He dipped the pen into the inkwell. The black ink glistened, catching the dim light from the desk lamp. For a moment, he simply held the pen above the page, as if the words might form themselves without his hand. Then, slowly, he began. "There is a place beyond the end of breath, beyond the weight of blood and bone. I have been there. I was not sent back by chance." His handwriting was slow but deliberate, each letter shaped with care. He did not write like a man making an argument. He wrote like a man leaving a map. "The one I met was not bound by the borders. We draw, not concerned with the names we give to faith or to nations. He did not ask me what I had done for my country, nor what I had believed. He asked only who I was, stripped of all the things I thought defined me. The words came faster now, the ink flowing easily. I understood then that we live most of our lives in armor we do not know we are wearing. We are taught to fight for causes, to defend symbols, to obey voices we cannot see. And yet, when we stand in that light, none of those things follow us. Only what we have given in truth remains. Only the way we have carried others when they could not walk themselves. He paused, laying the pen down for a moment. The air in the room felt heavier, as though the truth he was shaping on paper carried its own weight. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the loose metal sheet on the maintenance shed. He thought of Omar not in the chaos of the cockpit, but in the quiet before takeoff, when the world still seemed whole. He picked up the pen again. I do not know why I was sent back and not kept there. I do not know why I was shown what I was shown, but I know this. If you are reading these words, it is because the time for silence has ended. Do not wait for the moment you are forced into the light to understand how you should live in the shadows. Start now. His mind returned to the field, the smell of the grass, the warmth of the robe, the steady hum that was not heard with the ears. It had been weeks since the crash, but the memory had not faded. If anything, it had grown sharper, as if the distance between here and there was not measured in time at all. He leaned back in the chair, the pen still in his hand, staring at the half-finished page. How could he explain the look in those eyes? The weightless certainty of knowing you were fully seen, fully known, and yet not condemned. Language was too small for it, and yet, it was all he had. There was no judgment in his voice, only truth. A truth that strips away all excuses, all lies we tell ourselves. I saw the harm I had done, not as punishment, but as fact. I saw the moments I could have chosen differently and did not. I saw the times I had walked past someone in need, my eyes fixed on duty while my soul turned away. His throat tightened as he wrote, and yet, I was not cast aside. I was offered a choice, to go on, or to return. And in that choice, I understood the meaning of mercy not as something earned, but as something given because it is in his nature to give it. A sudden noise broke the silence. Footsteps outside his door. They stopped for a moment, then moved on. He waited until the sound faded before continuing. If you believe this is only a story, then let it be a story that changes you. If you believe it is truth, then let it be truth that shapes you. Either way, you cannot walk away untouched. He signed nothing. There would be no name, no rank, no date. The letter was not meant to be traced back to him. It was meant to be carried forward, hand to hand, until it reached the one it was written for. When the ink dried, he folded the pages carefully, aligning the edges as if sealing something fragile. He slid them into a plain envelope, pressing. The flap closed with the flat of his palm. The motion felt final, but not like an ending, more like planting something in the earth, knowing it would grow unseen for a time. From the top drawer of his desk, he pulled out a small tin box. Inside were only 3 things: a photograph of his mother, a medallion from his first year of service, and a key. He placed the envelope inside, closed the box, and locked it. The key he slipped into the lining of his jacket, where no one would think to look. The room felt colder now, not empty, just settled, like the air after a storm. He turned off the lamp, letting darkness reclaim the space. The hum of the generator outside was still steady, still unbroken. As he lay down on the bed, the field returned to him not in a dream, but as if it had always been there, waiting behind his thoughts. He could almost hear the voice again, not in words, but in the same certainty that had carried him back. He closed his eyes and allowed himself a final thought before sleep. When the time comes, they will know. The generator hummed. The wind moved. Somewhere beyond the walls of the base, life went on as it always had. But Khalid knew that nothing, no border, no order, no silence would keep this message from finding its way, and in that knowing, he slept.